Today we've got Peter Park back for our third and final episode of our exploration of how history became colonized. We began this podcast talking about a man named Meiners, who's a super racist dude, and Immanuel Kant, who's this extraordinarily well-regarded and championed philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant and this guy Meiners really played off each other. So essentially, we're going inside a propaganda campaign that we all still live in, except we don't call it propaganda, we call it history. I wanted to mention as well that because we go so far back, we really go into origins. We really get talking about what these guys in the 18th and 19th centuries, where they thought civilization originated, since, as we've mentioned before, nobody thought it was Greece except for, these two racist guys. And so it's interesting because you can trace it back through DNA, you can trace it back through language, seeing where certain roots of words come from. You can also look at it through religion and see who took whose gods. And you can also see it in philosophical thought. You can see it in ideas. And so this episode does complement in a lot of ways the episode that I did with Amalia Nana-Desikin in the writing revolution. So if this interests you and you're interested in cross-referencing to see how some of the unanswered questions here may be answered through the lineage of spoken language and written language, that'd be a good podcast to check out as well. We also kind of wrap at the end of this as well. It doesn't escape us that this topic interests us and we are both Asian, we're both Korean, and there are other podcasts that are interested in this. It is interesting to people of color who have actually studied philosophy. I mean, that's Cornel West. The guy's a philosophy professor. And you have really well-known philosophers as well, people of color, and they're very interested in race because the white people in philosophy, until people of color came into it, really didn't look at it. They didn't notice, and why would you when you look around and your classroom is just all white men? So I was really pleased that at the end, Peter and I kind of wrap about what does it mean? How do we move philosophy in a direction of being more diverse and having people with different backgrounds come and offer their perspectives on this material and try to get philosophy sort of back on track, if it ever was on track. And also to put these ideas out there of the history that was lost. Not just the history that was lost, but the history of history that was lost, which I think can offer some insight, because the reason that I'm so interested in this podcast and in my life about origins is because when you look out into the world and it's so crazy and we do everything wrong, we do food wrong, medicine, sex, politics, you name it, work, we do it all wrong. And I have a sense that at some point in history, I don't know how far back you go, probably before there's written language, but it seemed like they were doing a lot more right. When you see pictures of Native Americans, they're 100 years old, they have all their teeth, they don't have any gray hair, they look great, they're like 50, and they don't look like they've had Botox, they just look like they've aged really gracefully. So I do think that there has been a time when people weren't just totally screwed up, which I think, we're sort of in a global asylum right now. And so I'm always asking the question of how did we get here, because that story directly affects how I got where I am, how I got so sick. It all ties together because I'm part of it. This astronomy professor I had, forever ago, when we were talking about trying to figure out the speed of the universe, how fast is the sun moving in the Milky Way? And he was saying that we don't know. We don't know how fast we're moving. What's the point of reference? Is there a place in the universe that's still, that we can measure ourselves against? And he said something that I found so profound, which is that it's a very tricky thing to figure out what you're in when you're in it. We're in life. We're in history right now. We're in this society, and it's hard to figure it out because you can't step outside of it and get into this external perspective and That's sort of what Marx was all about. It's just like, hey, let's get rid of this Christian God who's somehow like hanging out somewhere, looking in and isn't actually like in this with us. Like, why would we develop a bunch of values and judgments from that place? Like, let's bring this to earth. So all of this is to say that Peter was very generous in having this conversation and talking about his personal thoughts and his experiences in the academy, in the university. We even talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of double consciousness, which I never really understood what it was until Peter explained it. So thank you, Peter. We do get a little bit technical in this. It's really hard not to get technical on some level because there's certain words that only belong to philosophy. It's like another language where, you hear one of those crazy Japanese words, which means like, you look worse after your haircut or something like that. And, philosophy has a lot of that stuff. So sometimes it might get technical, and I apologize for that. We do our very best, but I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a taste of how much we are translating, to give you a sense of how difficult it is to have a normal conversation. So here's a passage from Kant. Just as for the cognition of an object distinct from me, I also need an intuition in addition to thinking of an object in general, in the category, through which I determine that general concepts, so for the cognition of myself I also need an addition to the consciousness, or in addition to that which I think myself, an intuition of the manifold of me, through which I determine this thought. And I exist as an intelligence that is merely conscious of its faculty for combination but which, in regard to the manifold that is to combine. See, you don't want to read this stuff. So people like Peter have read this stuff. I read this stuff like, oh my god, ages ago. And we are trying to take what is actually very profound from stacks of books with writing like this and try to not only make it clear what they were saying and offer our perspective of it as people of color, as people with our lives and our distinct backgrounds, but also to show why it matters to people like you, why it matters to a subway worker, why it matters to someone in eating at McDonald's, why this matters. Why is it relevant? And it's sad, and I get upset because I do think it's so important, and yet, this is inaccessible. Who wants to read this shit, first of all, and second of all, only a very small sliver of very privileged people can take the time to read this and can break it down and figure out what the hell he's talking about. So if we do get a little bit technical, I apologize and I ask for your forgiveness, but you can see that we're really trying. This stuff is crazy. One thing I do want to say before I sign off is that insofar as we want to say that history begins in Greece, those people who espouse that also espouse that history begins with Plato. And just like people cherry-pick the Bible, people cherry-pick philosophy. And the manner in which Plato and Aristotle are presented often completely ignores and rewrites in a lot of ways who these people were. They try to make them into people who would totally be socially acceptable today, or would totally be in line with our scientific thought today. And they completely disregard the mysticism. And it's frequently not talked about, but it's pretty clear that Socrates was a giant mystic. In Plato's dialogues and where other authors wrote about him as well, because he was quite a character. He was always talking about the daemon, the spirit, talking about the oracles, the gods. And, this is the lineage of Plato and Aristotle. And Aristotle was in many ways an animist. And this kind of thinking gets squashed out so that you have this direct line from super rationalist Plato all the way to Kant. And then people say the pinnacle of the West is High Europe. High Europe is it, and philosophy ended with Kant because Kant is Jesus. So all these things matter because you can't figure out how to get out of what you're in if you don't understand what it is that you're in. And so that's the question that I think forms part of the project of what this podcast is. It's really clearly identifying, even though it hurts sometimes, to see what it is that we're in so that we can look at other alternatives like the paradigm that surrounds plant medicine and the sacred. So thank you so much. It's really an honor and a privilege to do this podcast with you as my audience. And without further ado, here's Peter. I kind of just wanted to cover the Neo-Kantians generally today. I divide them up between the racist Neo-Kantians and the non-racist Neo-Kantians, but you cover a few interesting details in the chapter on the racist Neo-Kantians that I think are worth discussing. You start the chapter off talking about something I had never heard of before, which is other racialization and self-racialization.
Yes.
Which I thought was really interesting. So other racialization is domination, oppression, exploitation. And self-racialization is Clarence Thomas, where you hate yourself. And it's more about exclusion and extermination and destruction. So you point this out so that we can follow the threads of that. Because I feel like racist people often only recognize one kind of racialization. And so then they claim that this entire other area of racism isn't really racism.
Yes.
Because it's sort of implicit or not as, visually obvious. So I just wanted the audience to sort of keep those two definitions in mind as we proceed.
Yes. So the only thing I would add to what you said is that self-racialization is more latent or subconscious. Another way of saying it is identity formation with the element of race as a part of forming one's identity. So that can happen without domination over a racial other, violence, which I guess is a form of domination. So the passage that you're referring to is from a book by Pierre-André Taillefer, a French scholar, and it was eye-opening to me too. I definitely derived some insights into how to conceptualize racism as a process involving self and other, and going in both directions, from the self to the other as a process of racialization, and also the self towards the self.
Yeah, the more obvious one is when you're imposing your own set of cultural understandings and beliefs onto another person. And the other kind is sort of slowly silencing the belief of the other.
Yes, okay, that's a clear view of it, definitely. That's the exclusion, kind of making mute, or exactly as you said, silencing the other from the dialogue or from the process by which we understand who ourselves to be.
It's a quieter method, sort of, a whimper and not a bang. So both of these kinds of racism we're seeing in operation during the period of history that we're talking about. So one of the interesting things about your book is that at the end of the 18th century, the question about whether philosophy has Greek or Oriental origins became a matter of debate again. That this wasn't debated at all since ancient times, like with the Romans. So over 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later, this is reappearing again as a hotly debated topic among philosophy nerds anyway. And so I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the period between those two eras. Like, why wasn't it debated? What did they believe that made this not really a debatable thing?
Well, the main condition is the centrality of Bible-based or mainstream religion-sanctioned view of the origins of humanity, which are Eastern. So definitely those areas of Asia that are depicted or discussed in the Old Testament. So that would be the Near East, that would be Mesopotamia, Egypt, but also the parts of the East that are adjacent to Mesopotamia, because, where is the Garden of Eden? Or where could it have been? And those peoples in Genesis, the book of Genesis, how far east did they migrate after Babel, right? And then, of course, they became distinct peoples that reappear later on in the Old Testament. So Asia is where human societies and human civilization first arose. Civilization meaning religion, the sciences, the arts, and all the human crafts or trades that make life in society possible. So that is the prevalent view of human origins and therefore also philosophy, Asian roots.
Right. So the idea was for so many centuries that the first philosophers were Adam or Moses or the Jews, maybe the Egyptians in Africa. Some cited Zoroaster, which would have been in Near East Asia. But something interesting is happening. There were a lot of scholars who were in agreement that it all started from Egypt.
Yes.
And it's also interesting to mention, too, that even the scholars who, previous to this racialized Kantian time period, even the historians who did regard the Greeks as the first quote unquote true philosophers, they had no problems with the many stories of these Greek philosophers traveling to and studying in Egypt.
Yes, so you're referring to the story of Plato having gone to, I think it was Egypt, and also Pythagoras having gone to Phoenicia and or Egypt. Also, the fact that the first Greek philosopher of the pre-Socratics, Thales, that he had a Phoenician roots through his parentage. Other stories are about more mythological figures in Greek tradition that are considered Egyptian forefathers or immigrants, right, or settlers to the Greek mainland. The fact that Egypt had this reputation for science among the Greeks, and that some of the Greek gods were actually related or Greek versions of Egyptian gods.
Yeah, I think it's easy to see a direct lineage in the sense that, the Romans took the Greek gods. It's also equally obvious to see that the Greeks took the Egyptian gods. And so
Right.
why not explore the idea that maybe their philosophical ideas were lifted from Egypt as well?
Yeah, and I would add to that the evidence that many Phoenician and some Egyptian words or root words are in the Greek language, that the Greeks took and modified Phoenician script for their own script, Greek script. So there are all these levels of evidence of transmission from Egyptian and Phoenician, which is a local Semitic, like across the eastern part of the Mediterranean, a local Semitic culture, transmissions of cultural elements from Asia and Africa, specifically Egypt, to the Greek peoples in a very early time. So there's all this evidence that, in fact, the first racist philosophers who are rewriting the history of philosophy so as to give it a Greek origin were aware of, right? And arguments or evidence that then they had to challenge, undermine, and question. So this is like a fight. It's a fight against existing historical and intellectual tradition that saw the Egyptians as partly the originators of Greek civilization. And the Greeks knew that the Egyptians were older okay, and that they had grown a civilization there along the Nile before themselves, the Greeks. So there is this awareness, and in fact, it's more than awareness, it's historical tradition and a kind of written memory of Egyptian origins that the Greeks had as a part of where they came from.
I think it's worth pointing out that a man named Johann Ernst Schubert, one of Kant's contemporaries, that he surveyed the philosophies of the Persians, Phoenicians, Arab Jews, Indians, Chinese, Egyptians, Ethiopians, Druids or Celts, early Romans, and Etruscans before he even got to the Greeks. So this was in the ether. And then when we get to 1780, which is first date, we're covering your book, Racism and the Formation of the Philosophical Canon from 1780 to 1830, that in the 1780s, a scholar named Plessing argued precisely what you're saying, that Egyptian knowledge was the root of Greek philosophies. But he said something very interesting as well, that even the Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian philosophies pointed to or were surviving remnants of an even more ancient system, which, again, they did not necessarily distinguish from divine revelation. And it's precisely around this time that you're covering in this book that a major alternative developed to the belief in the Egyptian origin of scientific civilization, which is the belief in an Indian one. And this came from, I'd imagine, British colonization and really sort of just the discovery of India became a hot new destination. And so you've got guys like Voltaire calling India the cradle of the arts, the most ancient civilization. Mathematicians are coming along saying that they believe that Indian astronomy is the most original and most ancient astronomy, and that even the priests of Egypt and the sages of Greece inherited their wisdom from the Indians. So can you talk a little bit more about this shift and what that debate sort of looked like? Because I'm sure the people who were major, Egyptomaniacs probably didn't appreciate that very much.
In the 18th century, the Old Testament view of the human past is crumbling. And by the latter part of the 18th century, it's basically exploded to then make possible these alternative and hybrid accounts of human origins. So partly biblical and partly not.
So that the reign of the Jewish fairy tale has ended, and now people are looking to fill that void.
Yes. And so Egypt is still a major contender as the earliest civilization from which, therefore, the Jews, as well as the Greeks, derive parts of their civilization and their religion and such, right, their culture. So that's one view. But there was this vogue for India, and by the way, before India, for China in the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century. China is an alternative origins for European civilization. And so the premise is that there was an original civilization, and that what civilization is a passing down of knowledge as well as a adding to the knowledge, right, as in growth. So passing down civilization and growing civilization. So you have a linear model of civilization growing over time from a beginning point. And so with this assumption, the question was, well, is Egypt the original civilization and Indian civilization the civilizational hand-me-down, right, from the Egyptians? So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that India is the origin and that Egyptian civilization is derived, or that Egyptian civilization is the descendant of Indian civilization. And then, of course, a generation before, the philosophers and the historians that I cover in my book, they held the possibility that China was the first civilization and that Egypt would be a descendant civilization of the Chinese. So you see that we're dealing with a finite number of possibilities here, according to this model. And they even had a way of understanding how, let's say, the Indians might have been descended from the Egyptians, or how the Egyptians might have been descended from the Chinese. The 18th century European historians that I study, they even had theories of how civilizations were passed down or handed down. One theory was through ancient colonization, right? So that some colonists migrated from China to Egypt, planting civilization in the West from the East, right? And then, of course, there is the view that between India and Egypt, there was commerce and also travel, and that either the Indians founded Egyptian civilization through colonization, or that the Egyptians founded Indian civilization through colonization. So, and they have an example of colonization because the Europeans were colonizing America and Africa and spreading European culture to these non-European places. So they thought that this happened in ancient times.
Right. They're sort of projecting their sins onto the past. And so you've got a lot of chicken and egg philosophy going on, trying to figure out where what started and gave root to the next. And then there's this guy who says something really interesting, William Jones, who I think he should have been named Indiana, but that's a different story. But he was really cool, and he has yet another theory that echoes the theory we already talked about, where he says, okay, we've got Pythagoras, we've got Plato, we've got the sages of India now in play. And then he says, okay, but maybe their theories came from a third, even earlier source. So, you're looking at the DNA of language. Like you said, you've got Greek, Latin, Germanic, Celtic, Sanskrit languages. They're all related in a family that they can see. That in the same way that it sort of points to an original lost mother tongue, that was actually the earlier source that then gave birth to these lineages that we actually know about and have evidence of. So we can get into that later. What's sort of funny is that the classical sources state that there were colonists from Egypt and Phoenicia, and that they founded civilization in Greece. But then Meiners does something amazing, which is that he actually argues that the Hindus were the students of the Greeks. And you note something that's just, I don't know, it's such a huge blind spot for academia, and it sort of illustrates the blindness that we're still operating in, which is that no historians of the history of philosophy have ever mentioned that Meiners' account of these ridiculous theories of the origins of philosophy were completely consistent with his racist views. So I wanted to talk briefly about how Meiners did classify the races, because it's pretty interesting. And he left behind works of both technology and history of philosophy that show us how racism and Eurocentric history of philosophy pretty much go hand in hand. But yeah, the way he breaks down and organizes his racism is pretty interesting, because he splits up certain white people even. It's like he doesn't see all whites as equal. Blacks, of course, are always at the bottom of everything, whether you're Mormon or a Moonie or, whatever race or whatever country you're in. But, he makes these two broad differences, which is Caucasian and the Mongolians. But of course, Mongolian also includes Hindus and black people. But he also distinguishes between Celtic and Slavic when it comes to the Caucasians. So Greeks and Germans are better than people living like around the Balkans.
Yes, and that's exactly how Meiners would think about it, just in terms of better, in terms of stronger, in terms of like more ingenious. It's a very crude way of classifying, studying peoples and nations, but he did it. And in fact, for him, it made sense to do it because he saw all of nature in a hierarchy of greater and lesser. including diverse human groups. He mainly went by the term peoples, but without needing to explicitly say that his own views are racist, right? Definitely racial concepts are at play. And what he's doing is he's thinking about different human groups in terms of a kind of hierarchy of labor in a way that colonists and pro-colonialists would be interested in understanding the human groups that are available for labor in America and also in Africa, the transatlantic basin. And so what I do now, because there has been some time for me to keep on thinking about these topics, is I like to see the racial hierarchy as a colonial hierarchy of people that are within the colonial empires in terms of their labor capacity and their labor qualifications. And so this racial way of thinking is a colonial way of thinking. And it so happens that Meiners was pro-colonial, and he thought that European colonial expansion was a good, and that one of the things it was doing was bringing civilization to the rest of the world, non-European world, right? So Meiners is pro-colonial, okay? And so on the one hand, we have his pro-colonialism, and on the other hand, we have his racism, right? And that's another way in which the two work hand in hand, as well as the colonialism and racism working hand in hand or hand in glove with his account of scientific civilization and even the history of religion, because he sees European Christianity as the most evolved form of human religious consciousness or knowledge. So all of this is like he's creating a whole worldwide global structure through his work, right? So that's something that is kind of new, and I've thought about more recently. But the racism is not disconnected from a worldwide European colonial domination.
Yeah, and then Kant also comes into play here because it's also in the 1780s that he begins to really defend the notion that the Greeks invented philosophy and also science. He also echoes Meiners in identifying distinctive races according to a hierarchy. But he also does something interesting which hasn't been done yet, which is that he defines racial characteristics by skin color. So this allows him to say that only white people have the capacity for abstract concepts. They're the only ones who have brought all of the revolutions and therefore evolution to human history, that they're the only ones who have ever had any progress. But part of this is because he has rewritten history to support this. So he's kind of trying to hit it from both sides. And so Kant and Meiners are rivals, but they're also really playing off each other. Then on the other side of things, you have people who are taking the Kantian notions of progress and they're taking his philosophy, but they're not importing the racism of Kant. And
Well, they're separating. They're able to separate Kant's racial anthropology from the other parts of his philosophy, like the critique of pure reason and his metaphysics of morals and his cosmopolitanism. They're able to separate those parts of Kant from his racial anthropology, yes.
right. And so in a way, they're able to take Kant's thinking forward and look at history while also sort of carrying the torch of how history was perceived before Kant, in the sense that they take a serious look at Africa and Asia and don't discount them, but still see them as part of this progressive lineage.
I see. So now you were referring to those neo-Kantians, otherwise known as German idealist philosophers who came right after Kant, in the generation after Kant. So yes, definitely There is some dispute about the Greek origins thesis, even after Kant spoke in favor of it, even after Kant not just spoke, but argued very methodically or deliberately in favor of Greek origins of Europe, and also taking a definition of civilization from Greek civilization. And these others are writing their histories of philosophy in the early 19th century. Their names are Friedrich Ast and Thaddeus Anselm Rixner. These are two Bavarian philosophers.
And that's Ast, A-S-T, so that people don't get any ideas.
Yes, Ast with a T on the end, yes. And they're Bavarian, they're Catholic. They too have studied up on Kant's philosophy. In a way, they are continuing his project, just like in a way Hegel is building on Kant, right? Or in a dialogue with Kant, and doing some of what Hegel is doing is extending Kant's thought, especially Kant's history of philosophy and Kant's cosmopolitanism. And also, Hegel is in agreement with, Kant's appreciation of racial differences, right? So that those things are in Hegel, but these other idealists, and they are the same generation with Hegel, Ast and Rixner, very explicitly reject racial hierarchies and the pro-Greek thesis or account of human origins for the one that is older. It's the one that is less racist or less, let's say, tainted by the racism of Meiners and Kant. And that would be to start the history of philosophy and therefore the history of civilization in Asia. And they were even more specific because they saw the origin point as being India. Right. So these are two German idealist philosophers who have read up on their Kant and are similar in terms of their own philosophical projects to Hegel's project, but they are writing the history of philosophy starting with India. So, and this is just within years after Kant and other Kantians are excluding Asia from the history of philosophy.
Yeah, they do an interesting thing because they show that this is not a mutually exclusive thing. That you can appreciate these early origins while also giving Greece its due. And they seem to do this by seeing distinct eras in the history of philosophy that I thought, which answered a lot of my questions, that I thought was really interesting. So they sort of see philosophy as cycles where you start off with a unity that separates and then comes back to a higher place and achieves a unity again. And they believed that the first cycle began and ended in India, and that the second cycle then began in Greece. So it's compatible to some degree with the histories that these racist people are purporting. It's interesting because they're comparing it to the history of mathematics, which I think pretty much undeniably began in Southeast Asia, maybe not even necessarily India. It might have started in Cambodia. But
wow.
It's where the earliest recorded zero has been found.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but that's pretty recent. So it gets us into this idea of history and the fact that history could end, which is like a hot topic. And so I wondered what they might have said if you asked them, what does the end of history look like? Is it when you come to the end of one of these cycles and then there's no need to then separate and delineate out and recollect into a higher point in the unity?
Well, for Kant and Hegel, history does end with European civilization.
Right, because it's the end-all, be-all of everything.
Exactly.
It's like mission accomplished behind George Bush.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Except it says, Europe.
Right, and it's behind Kant and Hegel, right?
Yes. But for Ast and Rixner, I would interpret their theory of human and philosophical history as just ongoing in a cycle that differentiates from earlier cycles, but definitely moving forward to therefore kind of leave the future open. Because of their view of the cyclical nature of human history, I wouldn't be surprised if they allow for a civilization to kind of return to a Asian focus, right? Or the scene of history in the making shifts from the West to Asia again.
And maybe even watching the disciplines like history and philosophy and religion all kind of go back into their original boiling pot and maybe even become indistinguishable from one another.
Yes, so that boiling pot where all the what, in contrast to modern life, all the parts of civilization are integrated, right? Our religion with our science, our bodies with our minds, our morals with our physical needs. This integration would be a return to how human nature and human life was integrated at the beginning in Asia. For Aston Rixner, this would be India. But it would also be new. It would be a reintegration. So, in other words, the return is kind of like not exactly a repetition, but a new recombination, a recombination of the parts of civilization into a new unity, right? So, in other words, they don't quite see in the future everyone becoming Hindus because human civilization has experienced much more than just ancient Asian unity of religion and philosophy, right? Because there has been obviously technological change and social change. And so I think they would conceive of the future holding unity, but in a new form or a new version from the unity of life that the ancients experienced.
Like I think of it kind of as like an original wolf, and then from wolf you descend a bunch of different pure breeds of dogs. And
Mm.
then it's kind of like if you got all those individual dogs to breed again and make like a super dog.
Wow.
And that might be their, you get like a super mathematical spiritual philosophy history or something like that.
Yes.
Because evolution is definitely a major part of it.
For Austin Rixner, definitely. They want to be able to.
And that's the Kantian thread that I think is so important. Because what gets me is that, they're not like anti-reason. They just see a different place for it as not the oracle itself. You mentioned the Catholic, whereas Hegel and Kant, I assume, were Protestants,
Yes.
being Germans at that time, post Luther. But the way Ost and Rixner envision history and envision philosophy is very sympathetic to Eastern thought in general. And so you write that Ost believed that philosophy has an eternal essence, and that the different philosophical systems that we've seen over the course of civilization are simply versions of a single unified philosophy, like they're all covers of a song that started by, an original person.
Yes.
And,
yes. Perfect.
And then Ost equated historical systems of philosophy as incarnations of spirit, which I thought was really interesting. Did he understand spirit? Because when I read spirit, I sort of inferred what he meant. But what did he mean by incarnations of the spirit? Do you think that's more in line with Eastern thought and the ideas of earlier animist beliefs of there being the spirit that permeates all living things?
I think Ost's understanding of spirit would be a lot more predictable and ordinary than you would like it to be. I think he might mean spirit in its contrast with body. So, he would have been aware of the Cartesian definition of spirit. So, all he means by that is unquantifiable human intelligence.
which does not automatically reduce to pure reason.
No, because spirit has to be the agent of both philosophy and religion, right? And intuition and all these things. And by the way, so in other words, it's like the reasoning faculties. But Kant talks a lot about that part of reason which is pure, but that lets you know that he sees human reasoning or intellectual faculties as various, as consisting of parts. So this is kind of like the other thing it reminds me of, and I think it probably reminds you with your background in Aristotle, but Ost and Rixner do work from a kind of Aristotelian or Greek, and this is now largely, modern and Western, notion of the soul. So what they mean is, by spirit, is they mean like the powers of the soul to sense, to analyze, and to take sensory experience and to bring it together to create knowledge. So they mean the faculties of knowledge when they say spirit.
The abstract thing that animates bodies and coheres experience.
Yes. Now, animates body, that's kind of in Aristotle because that's the vegetative part of the soul. So I'm not sure if Kant and Rixner really strongly adhere to that and are elaborating on that. But the abstracting part of the soul, so the understanding and reason, those parts of the soul, and not the vegetative soul, my view is that they're mainly concerned with that. When the German idealists talk about Geist.
Right, and Geist is where we get our word for ghost, but it also gets translated into spirit, like Zeitgeist means spirit of the times. So it's a flexible word. It's also the word for the humanities. They don't call it the humanities. They call it spirit studies.
Yes, Geisteswissenschaft.
Yeah. But I guess what I'm sort of trying to understand is when we talk about spirit, are they talking about mind, or is there a spiritual, what we would consider to be a spiritual element in that understanding of spirit? Because when you're sort of breaking down how they're defining the undivided unity, the boiling pot, or life in its original state, it does have all of those elements of what we consider to be the spiritual.
I see. So I would answer that question by saying both Kant on the one hand and Ast and Rixner on the other are referring to reason when Ast and Rixner use the term Geist or spirit. So that's more in line with Kant than I think you're wondering about. You're wondering if they have a different appreciation of spirit as being something broader and undefinable, and yet having this large role in human cognition, larger than, the role that reason has. I think that's what you're asking, but my impression is that they're working very closely with Kant's idea of reason when they say spirit.